was 50 years ago, in 1963, that thousands of church members traveled to Jekyll Island, Georgia, for the very first Feast of Tabernacles to be observed on this tranquil, historic island. After a long drive down the causeway and over the narrow bridge to the island, they were greeted by what was perhaps the largest tent anyone had ever seen, pitched by the ocean shore. That tent was where God's church assembled daily during the Feast of Tabernacles to worship and praise Him. Anyone who kept the Feast at Jekyll Island during those years has fond memories that will never fade. Jekyll Island, in 1886, was purchased to become an exclusive winter retreat for America's most elite families, known as the Jekyll Island Club. This exclusive club consisted of a collection of so-called cottages, which have now become National Historic Landmark. For more than half a century, the nation's leading families, including legendary Rockefellers, Morgans, Pulitzers, came to Jekyll Island to secure an escape. The Jekyll Island Club was called the richest, most inaccessible club in the world, and was the most exclusive resort in the nation. It is said its membership represented 1/6 of the world's wealth. God's people have been blessed with the opportunity to enjoy this wonderful environment for so many years. According to His commands, speak to the children of Israel, saying, "The 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to the Lord. You shall keep it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. 7 days you shall keep a sacred feast to the Lord your God in a place which the Lord chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce, in all the work of your hands, so that you shall surely rejoice." Let us now take a commemorative look back at the 50 years that God's church has celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles on Jekyll Island. In 1963, Jekyll Island became the third U.S. festival site, which relieved some of the overcrowding of the facilities at Big Sandy. It was the first East Coast feast site, enabling many brethren who were previously unable to attend from the East Coast due to the long journey. 4,789 brethren attended the feast that first year and were seated in the big tent.
My first trip to Jekyll Island was in the spring of 1963. I was working in Pasadena, living in Pasadena, and I was sent out to Birmingham, Alabama for Passover and unleavened bread. 2 years before, I'd been sent up to Sacramento, California, and as I was leaving, I was told, "Look and see if you can find a feast site." Since I've been successful one time. So we came to Jekyll Island. Actually, we were in Birmingham, and we'd had, I think it was a 7-day spring feast. And we were talking with some of the people around there, and they asked me what I was going to be doing. And I said, well, I'm supposed to find a convention site. And the cook said, well, I know a place you ought to go. He says, you ought to go over to Jekyll Island. I was cooking over there, and he says, it's a beautiful place. So my wife and I came over here to Jekyll Island and went back and reported to Pasadena that we thought this was a good place. So we came back and made the arrangements, and I was sent here that fall to organize the feast for 1963 and for 1964.
In the 60s, as brethren traveled to the feast in Jekyll Island, they often would drive in caravans of 2 to 8 vehicles that were crammed full of stuff. Brethren would see cars here and there with the diamond FT sticker on the rear bumper. In future years, the church adopted the little green rectangles. The closer one got to the feast, the more cars you would see with the feast sticker, and the more that the excitement grew. It was like an old family reunion. When you saw a car with a feast sticker, you knew that it would be okay if you had a flat tire or a breakdown on the road, because someone else with a feast sticker would stop to help you out. And people came from all over to worship God at His Feast of Tabernacles. His people literally took over the Jekyll Island area. As one long-time member said, once we got onto Jekyll Island, or St. Simon's Island, it seemed like everyone was in the church. People from all over the country, and some from Canada, were all talking about the same things, how they had come to hear of God's truth. As streams of people began pouring into the area, a problem arose. Hundreds had failed to request reservations for camping. The limited facilities of Cherokee Campground were soon filled to capacity. However, the years of experience in camping during the feast in Big Sandy began to pay off. As people were directed in how and where to set up their tents, they took every advantage of the remaining space. By the time everyone had arrived, nearly 1,600 of God's people had settled themselves into an area normally laid out for a third of that number.
I began attending church in November, right after President Kennedy was shot, and passed the big tent, so I went in and asked where the campground was. They told me it was at the north end of the island. We went up there, and we went and pitched our tent and registered. They had a little small booth as you entered there where you could register. Then while we were there, there was more people came than they expected. So some men got together with axes and bushes, took some bushes out and made some more campsites. So during the week of the feast, there was several men on a rotating basis would go out and do patrol duty at night. They didn't want it. There was enough men that you didn't have to do it every night, just maybe 2 or 3 times during the feast. So that, and came along pretty good, and we found it as a great experience there. So that was my first experience at the feast.
Of course, not everybody camped. Dozens of other families filled the island hotels. The Wanderer, now called the Oceanside Inn, the Buccaneer and Holiday Inn, just to mention a few. As they filled, the brethren stayed elsewhere off the island at neighboring Brunswick and St. Simon's Island.
Jekyll Island began as a feast site back in 1963. This was the first feast that my wife Norma and I observed together as a married couple. We had gotten married after graduating from Ambassador College. And during the feast, a lot of individuals had been counseled for baptism. Back at that time, they did not have many of the members did not have a local church to attend. And so therefore they came to the feast to counsel. I baptized one afternoon 44 people after services. And they wanted them baptized in the ocean, so we had to walk out in the ocean. The tide was going out, so we had to continue going out further. We got several hundred yards out into the ocean. One of the reasons I remember that is because it was so cold out there. So they had to wade all the way out and come back, and they came back to our motel room, and ministers laid hands on them, and they received the Holy Spirit.
Hi, I'm Wayne Stevens, and I remember Jekyll Island back in what we call the old days. 1967, 68, 70, and 71. At least I know I was there those years, and I do remember very, very vividly the storms we would have. The water would come pouring down the tent poles, and they would always make announcements from the stage, "Don't look up, don't look up." And when we did look up, because when you're told not to look up, everybody looks up, the light bulbs would be bursting. They didn't want the glass to fall in your eyes. I remember one time we had to put our feet up on the rungs of the chairs because the water was flowing across the tent floor, which was formerly a parking lot. So it was asphalt floor. So I do remember the storms doing that. I also remember the long, long lines for lunch across the street at the restaurants, either there or in Brunswick.
No one could forget the large tent that we met in twice a day to hear the feast sermons. Brethren couldn't get enough, even though it was over 90 degrees under that tent and the humidity was over 90%, and we had to use portable toilets that were hotter than the tent. Brethren were so excited to be there. The weather has often been a factor and a topic of conversation about the feast in Jekyll Island. The fall is part of the hurricane season in the Atlantic area, and Jekyll has had its fair share of hurricanes and strong winds over the years. Some of those have woven their way into Feast of Tabernacles lore. In 1963, even before the feast began, Jekyll Island was threatened with heavy winds. These winds would have greatly hindered at the erection of the huge 250-foot tent. However, the night before the tent arrived, the winds died to a refreshing and cooling breeze. The next day, within a matter of 8 hours, the tent was up and in shape for services. The next year, in 1964, the Hurricane Dora hit. God's protection was very evident as his people gathered to worship him and keep his feasts.
They call her Dora, but she is no lady. The fourth major hurricane of the season, Dora, slams at Jacksonville Beach and points north and south along the Florida-Georgia coastline. Winds of 100 miles an hour and upwards plowed mountainous seas across the beaches. At one point, the storm covered an area greater than the New England states. The calm eye of the storm took 2 hours to pass over St. Augustine, as more than 30,000 people took refuge in schools and hospitals along the coast. In St. Augustine, much of the beach was lost to erosion. One 60-foot section of the seashore just disappeared. In Savannah Beach, Georgia, the polling lists were moved 15 miles inland so people could ballot. If you had to put it to a vote, Dora was the most unpopular girl in town.
The hurricanes. By far, the worst year for the hurricanes at the Feast of Tabernacles on Jekyll Island would have been 1964. That was the year that just 2 weeks before the feast was to start, Hurricane Dora made landfall in Jacksonville, Florida, just a little bit south of Jekyll Island, with winds well in excess of 100 miles an hour. This is the storm you would have heard stories about that ripped the roofs off of hotels, downed power lines, uprooted trees, really making a complete mess of the island. While they were in the throes of cleaning that up the best they could in 2 weeks, just 2 days before the feast started, Hurricane Gladys approaches. She doesn't make landfall, but she's certainly large enough, powerful enough, that she makes her presence felt. She unleashes another torrent of heavy rains, high winds, and just makes a horrible situation desperate at this point. At this point in time, the island probably resembled more of a drowned rat than anything else. This was the storm that finally prompted the island officials to ask Mr. McCullough to call Pasadena and get them to cancel the feast. He called them, apprised them of the situation, but they said, look, it's only 2 days out. People are already on their way. It's too late. You're just going to have to make the best of it. And to his credit and to the credit of everyone who went that year, they did. Everybody got there and sort of pitched in and helped, did the best they could. Really, there wasn't any complaint that you know of. People just did what they could to make the best of the situation. It was an interesting year. Certainly when everybody got to the feast that year, the island was a pretty good mess.
The main highlight of every feast is the spiritual food we receive. Brethren listened as Mr. Armstrong asked the expected question.
Why are we here? Well, let me say once again, as I've said so many times through the years, we are here to look forward into and to, as it were, enjoy a part of the wonderful world tomorrow, of the time when there will be world peace, when all of this present time of trouble, of hardship, of frustration, of pain and sorrow and suffering will be over. A time when there will be universal salvation, and there certainly is not now.
The following morning, Mr. Armstrong impressed on the brethren that they came for a purpose. That purpose, of course, included keeping a festival that God had ordained and to receive instructions from God's trained ministers. They included that year many familiar names you will remember. Concluded the feast on Thursday afternoon with a sermon outlining the true meaning of the last great day. By the end of the feast, nearly 4,800 had registered, far exceeding the top figure of 4,000 that were anticipated. Between the daily services, brethren spent many hours making lifelong friends, learning how others came into the knowledge of God's truth. Families swam in the ocean, enjoyed the facilities of the huge Aquarama pool, and found themselves in the long lines in the cafeteria across the street from the tent. God's church continued to hold the annual feast at Jekyll Island, and in 1970, 7,600 brethren met for the 7th consecutive year and were still meeting in the huge tent. There was no hurricane watch that year. In 1975, Jekyll was one of the 50 feast sites held around the world, with a total attendance of nearly 80,000 worldwide. In 1977, the Jekyll Island Convention Center was the site of services, and the tent became only a fond memory. Brethren continued to gather for the Feast of Tabernacles at the Convention Center, except for a couple of years. In 2011, while the new Convention Center was being built, the church once again met in a tent, a greatly modernized version from the original.
Hi, my name is Barbara BRAUMULLER from Orlando, Florida, and I wanted to let everybody know that I was at the Feast of Tabernacles in Jekyll Island in 1969. We were in a giant tent that had to be brought in by 18-wheelers. And then also in 2011, when we were in a tent that you didn't even know it was a tent. Glass doors, air conditioned, carpet on the floors, and everything, so it was a big switch. But I wish you all a happy feast and happy 50th anniversary.
"2013 marks the 50th anniversary of the first feast held on Jekyll Island. There is a rich history and heritage here, as tens of thousands of people have traveled to Jekyll Island to celebrate God's feasts over the years. We're thankful to God for the experience of the Feast of Tabernacles each year. God has blessed us with a good foretaste of the unity, peace, accord, and great attitudes of service and joy that will mark His kingdom. Today, the Feast of Tabernacles is held in the beautiful and comfortable new Jekyll Island Convention Center. This is a far cry from the big tent of the 1960s and 70s that covered 2 acres and could seat 10,000. In the last 50 years, since 1963, many changes have occurred in the physical buildings we meet in, and even the accommodations we stay in on Jekyll Island. But there is a spiritual constant that overrides all the physical changes. The reason we gather here before God to observe His Feast of Tabernacles is the same today as it was when 4,900 first assembled here back in 1963. We are here to observe God's feast and to keep a foretaste of the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. When He returns, He will establish a government that will bring lasting peace, joy, and love to this earth. For 50 years, God's people have let their light shine on Jekyll Island. Let your light shine. Enjoy each other's company and fellowship in the presence of God in one of the places where He has placed His name, right here on Jekyll Island. As the feast closes each year back in 1960s and 70s, we sang a song, "God be with you till we meet again." May God be with all of us as we keep this feast.